Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining our Ask the Experts webinar for September. Today's topic is all about ponds, pond maintenance, and how to pass inspections. With us, we have Alex Cecil from Aqueduct. Said Aqueduct, or at least ponds are a topic I was just sharing with Alex that are complicated, at least to me, and so he's going to be teaching me a lot of things too. As a reminder, we do record this session, and we do hope that you will share these recordings with your fellow board members if they're not on the call tonight. Those can be found at camsmgt.com under the webinars section. Feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar. Alex said he'd love to get some questions and some things coming in that we can talk about. So if you have a question, use the Q&A option at the bottom of your page and type that question in, and I will read that question to Alex and we'll get it answered for you. So with that, Alex, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. So like you said, my name is Alex Cecil. I am with Aqueduct Lake and Pond Management. I am the Carolina branch manager, and I'm here to talk to y'all about pond maintenance and how to pass stormwater inspections. So first off, thank you again for having me. And I just wanted to remind you guys that Aqueduct is a partner with CAMS Trusted Service Provider Program. So we'd love to continue working with CAMS on that. Now, a little bit about myself and why you should trust anything I have to say. I mean, ponds maintain themselves, right? No. And I'm here to tell you a little bit more about that. But first, a little background on myself. I went to school at UNCW, where I received 2 degrees, one in marine biology and environmental science. And I was fascinated how water affects our lives and impacts us from day to day. As things like hurricanes and storms become more frequent in the Carolinas, we have more and more stormwater to deal with because we're having more rain events. And that's where I found my job. I've worked for 3 different lake and pond management companies, now dealing with stormwater and water quality. And now I'm bringing my knowledge over to Aqueduct as the Carolina regional manager, where we continue to grow the company and educate clients on how to maintain and improve their stormwater devices. So first off, what is stormwater? Well, stormwater is rain, snow melt that runs over various surfaces such as lawns, driveways, roofs, parking lots, construction sites, streets, things like that. Now, as they run across these surfaces, they're picking up various pollutants, things like pet waste, fertilizer, oil, chemicals, trash, sediment, anything that they come across, they're picking up and they're flowing into stormwater drains, devices, things like that. Normally, in the past, they would flow into our creeks and our natural spaces where they would negatively impact the wildlife, the water quality, and our watershed overall. Now, as development continues to increase, I'm sure we see it on a daily basis, new buildings and communities constantly popping up. Well, there's less pervious surface for water to penetrate and refresh into the groundwater. Because of that, there's more water runoff. So larger volumes of water are running down our streets, our communities, our parking lots, things like that, and they're flowing straight into our creeks and those natural spaces. So because we're overloading these creeks, we're causing sinkholes, flash flood events, things like that that stress our natural spaces. So as you can see in this image here, in a natural space or in a field, things like that, a lot of that water is evaporating or actually perking back down into the groundwater, and you're only getting about 10% of that that's actually running off. Now, in our urban areas, in our cities, you're actually getting 55% of that is actually runoff. So that's going into our storm drains, down our streets, things like that. So there's very little that's able to perk down into the ground and refresh things like aquifers. Now, why do we need these devices? So if it rains here in this field or out in a farm, well, the next day looks the exact same. Now, if it rains in a parking lot or in a community, well, we see these flooding events, especially down on the coast. I lived down in Wilmington, North Carolina for a number of years, and we'd have what's called sunny day raining. That's when it's not even raining, but the tides actually cause flooding where water's almost like a water fountain spewing out of manhole covers, drains, things like that. Now you can imagine what that looks like with stormwater when you do have these rain events. So normally you have a storm in a parking lot that would then flow into our creek and our stream. From there, you have pollutants that are going into our lakes, reservoirs, things like that. Well, they decided to put these SCMs or stormwater control measures in to act as a buffer or a filter. So instead of going from the parking lot directly to our natural spaces, now that runoff is flowing into these stormwater devices. So as that water enters, it's filtering out the sediment, the contaminants, debris, trash, anything that flows in there is settling out. And then from there, it's moving to our waterways. So we like to say that these SCMs act as speed bumps on the way to the waterway. Not only does it pull out contaminants and sediment, but it slows the energy of the water down. So if you could imagine all that water is being forced into these pipes and blowing into our creeks, that's a lot of water going in at one time. So instead, they go into these stormwater devices and they're acting as settling pools or holding ponds where that energy slows and you're preventing things like flash flooding or overloading our streams. Now, water leaves the basin typically cleaner and slower than when it entered. Now, for stormwater devices, this is what you may receive from the city, outlining each component of a stormwater device and if it's in a passing state or not. If you pass inspection, then you're good for the next year. Now, if you fail inspection, you typically have 90 days to make any repairs they deem necessary to pass, and that's dependent based on which area you live in and the inspectors. But depending on the penalty, you can have up to $15,000 fine daily. So places like Raleigh, North Carolina, they fine the owner of that device every day until the issue is resolved. Now, if you're in places like South Carolina, typically compared to North Carolina, your regulations are a little less strict than North Carolina, but in places like Columbia, starting to pick up in Charleston and other densely populated areas, your regulations are going to start getting a little more strict. You're going to see the city and municipality actually start making examples of communities. So that way everyone kind of follows suit with that. In North Carolina, if you live in the Raleigh-Durham area, you probably have the most strict regulations, such as if grass is higher than 12 inches on your slope or dam, you're getting fined daily. So things like that can really add up, especially when you're getting a couple $1,000s a day. Now, as you move away from Raleigh, your restrictions are getting less strict. Until you hit Charlotte again, it picks up a little bit just because it's a more densely populated area. But this is why it's better to be proactive with these devices than reactive, just because if they come through, you pass inspection, no big deal. If they do ding you for that, they're going to come back and re-inspect. And if you're still not passing, you're gonna end up having some fines to pay. Now, there's a variety of different SCMs that you may see in your communities. So they can vary from wet ponds, constructed wetlands, dry ponds, bioretentions or rain gardens, sand filters, undergrounds, and level spreaders. And I'll touch on each one of these as we move through. But they are all very important to maintain, not only for the regulation standpoint, but because they do mitigate sediment, pollutants, runoff. And so here we see not just the regulation, but a health concern. So if the fines don't bother you directly, your health could. The CDC recognizes that blue-green algae is of growing concern in bodies of water, especially these stormwater devices, because they're such small bodies of water. They're able to heat up quicker. They have a lot higher nutrient loads in them. So the blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, or as it's more popularly known, HABs, which stands for harmful algal blooms, needs three things to take off, and that's light, water temperature, and nutrients. It's safe to say in spring and summer, and even fall around the Carolinas, we have all three of these. It stays warm pretty much most of the year around here. And in the spring and summer, everyone wants greener grass. So there's those neighbors that throw a whole bag of fertilizer on the lawn. Geese are drawn to these devices because of the water and the types of plants that are there. And they're directly contributing to that nutrient load. So they're pooping in and around the stormwater devices. That's a lot of nutrients flowing right in there. And then we all have at least that one neighbor who refuses to pick up their dog's poop. Well, all of those things are making their way to the pond, and those stormwater devices, they're increasing the nutrient load in them. So they're making HABs that much easier to thrive in these systems. And I know as a kid, I couldn't stay out of any body of water, and that goes for my dogs as well today. If these basins aren't treated, they can be harmful to not only people, but your pets. So a couple of years back in the Charlotte area, we actually had a couple dozen dogs pass away just from recreating in stormwater devices or county ponds because they had HABs in them. So same thing I see all the time when I'm going around to different sites, kids fishing in them. There's no reported cases of humans dying from this, but it does make them pretty sick. So that's where you do want to make sure that you're reducing the nutrient load in them, and then you are managing them properly. And even if you're the healthiest person alive, you cannot tell me you'd rather look at the image on the left over the one on the right. These stormwater devices in many communities have been sold as waterfront properties or recreation areas, with the homes being situated around these ponds having to pay a little bit more, when in fact they are stormwater devices. That doesn't mean they have to look like a swamp either. Treatments and routine maintenance can prevent your ponds and basins from ever looking like the image that you see there on your left.
Hey, Alex, I had a question. So talking about wet ponds, and you get the dry ponds, do they have the same types of issues with fertilization, geese poop? And these are the ponds that will fill up with water but then drain down. Does harmful algae live in those as well?
Typically, no, if they're designed properly, because the dry pond, you usually have about 72 hours where that water is designed to hold in a dry pond. After 72 hours, if water is still holding in there, there's an issue with your dry pond. And that's more of a structural issue that we need to look at, as opposed to, anything else. The harmful algal blooms don't typically pop up that quickly. So by the time that system flushes, those harmful algal blooms are already gone. You're not really going to worry about those. Now, if water did pool in that dry pond for longer than 72 hours, you do run the risk of it, just because you're still getting a lot of those nutrients, the sunlight, and warmer water temperatures. You have to think, anytime you have a body of water that's shallow, it's heating up a lot quicker. So you're going to have increased growth in those systems, the shallower the body of water.
Good to know.
So in any stormwater device, you're typically going to look at a couple components of that. And these are typically because they can have the most damage and cost the most to repair. So things like inlets can have sediment separations leading to erosion and sinkholes further up the slope if they're not designed properly. Outlets can have a similar effect as well on these systems, becoming clogged due to lack of maintenance. So if on the backside of the dam, you have a lot of debris flowing through there, or it hasn't been mowed in a while, and then all of a sudden they mow that once a year, all that debris ends up clogging the outside of the pipe, and you essentially have a backup up the outlet barrel going into the riser, and the pond can't flow properly. So you end up flooding the basin essentially. Now, a pond can flood for many reasons. The riser can be clogged from wildlife such as beavers, or from storms and heavy rain events. It is important to clear these off when debris clogs them, because it only takes one rain event to raise the water level above the riser. Once above that riser, you should have a spillway that allows the water to leave the basin during larger events. Now, not all basins have these spillways. So if it doesn't have a spillway, then you're looking at having it flow over the next lowest point on the dam, And that's where you can start getting a lot of erosion on the back of the dam. If it's not compacted properly, you can have a complete dam blowout, which I've seen many times, and that becomes a very costly repair. And that's why routine inspection and maintenance is very important on these devices. If someone's not looking at each one of these on a regular basis, well, a sinkhole that forms on a dam can quickly turn into a dam blowout. And you went from a couple $1,000 repair and quick and easy over with to anywhere from 5 to 6 figure job, and you're having potentially even safety issues for if there's a community downstream from that dam, depending on how much water you're actually holding in that stormwater device.
So, Alex, speaking of dams, I have a dam question. So I'm on the board of the North Carolina Property Owners Association with little to no county oversight. We've been told by the builder developer that we do not need to worry about provisions of the O&M manual they signed with North Carolina DEQ. They turned ownership of the pond to the HOA last spring. We feel the builder should have handled all of the requirements before turning it over, but did not. Do we have compliance obligations now that they've turned it over to us? And now you may be getting into that in future parts. So you would say, yes, I'm getting into that, and don't answer the question, but
yeah, I can go ahead and answer it.
Okay.
Yes, you are responsible once the developer hands over these stormwater devices, no matter what it is, you are now responsible for every component of that. So if there's already issues with the device, if it wasn't built out properly, if it already needs dredging, all of those things now fall on the board and the community. So that's why it's very important to, even before a developer hands over a stormwater device, it's important to have it inspected by a third party, such as Aqua. So that way we can come in and say, hey, you guys are already sitting at $50,000 for repairs. You want to have them go ahead and repair these issues and then get re-inspected, because a lot of the times developers will hand this over knowing there's plenty of money and repairs that needs to go into this, but they want to get out on the cheap. So they hand it over to the community, hope no one knows any better, which most people don't if you don't have a background in this, because a pond looks like a pond. So you take it, you're good to go, and now it's yours. So in that instance, it's really hard to go back on the developer and get them to be held liable for those damages or repairs.
Okay, I'm going to ask two questions since you already touched on one of them, but how would a board member or manager know if it's a stormwater receptacle?
So I will touch on that here in a second. But typically, if there are inlet pipes that are draining the community, it is a stormwater device. So if runoff from the community enters the basin, it is a stormwater device. You'll also have something that's called an as-build, which I will go ahead and move over to now. This is an example of an as-build. These are plans that an engineer draws up for the community. Now, they don't just contain stormwater devices. They contain the roads, the electric, everything to build out that community is drawn up on these plans. They're very thick books. Every page is a different drawing, a different plan of something else, but there's multiple sections that are dedicated to stormwater devices. When you receive those from the developer, it is super important to hold on to these because they help show what that basin is supposed to look like. So when an inspector comes in, they already have these as-builds because they pulled them from the county, because the county has records of this, and they're going to look at it and say, okay, this is supposed to be a wet pond. This is how much water it's supposed to hold at any given time, things like that. And that's how they go off of their inspection. Now, as far as property managers, HOA board members, I would recommend either reaching out to the county or if you are a board member, reaching out to your property manager and seeing if they do have your as-builds. Because if a company like myself comes in and we're doing an inspection or a repair, we want those as-builds because that's going to tell us what we need to do to get it back in shape. So when you're looking at a pond or an SCM, that inspector has all these plans for everyone on your property. So that means they know that your dry pond should not be holding 8 feet of water in the middle of summer. So really, this is one of the best tools you can have as a board member or a manager. Try to find these. I cannot stress enough that you guys want these in hand when you're doing any kind of work, whether it's on the roads, to stormwater devices, anything like that.
Are as-built required
For what?
for turnover?
They're not required. Typically, developers do hand those over because it's essentially a blueprint of the entire community.
Mhm.
Now, communities that have been handed over many times, it's very hard for that new community to get a hold of the as-builds because typically someone has lost them or forgotten about them, but you can always go to the county and request them.
Okay, I'm trying to remember. Are as-built recorded? Are they generally recorded, Doc?
So yes, the county will always have a record of the as-built for every community because that's how they go back and inspect. So if the community manager doesn't have it and the developer, if they just hand it over and they don't have it, then you can always go to the county.
Okay. Had an HAB question, so harmful algae bloom question.
Yes.
Do fountains help prevent harmful algae blooms?
So fountains have been notoriously sold as this cure-all for algae in ponds. Fountains do help a little bit. It depends on the size of the pond. If the pond is massive and you put a small fountain in there, it's not going to do that much. If you put a large fountain for the correct size pond, you are getting some aeration benefit out of it. It just depends on the size of the body of water and the size of the fountain itself. If what you're looking for is to reduce harmful algal blooms, the best thing you can do is one, have a maintenance plan where they would come out and actually treat that body of water with chemicals that are actually aquatically safe and labeled to go in that body of water and around systems like that. But then if you're looking to install something, you're going to look at doing a bottom diffused aeration system. And I'll touch on that a little bit later, but that puts a lot of oxygen back into the water column, and HABs typically don't like well oxygenated bodies of water. But I will touch on that a little bit later. So with this as-built here, it essentially lays out everything you need to know about that structure. So if you need to have 20,000 plants around a pond, that as-built is going to tell you, and typically it's going to tell you the species of plants that need to be planted around that basin. So these are super important when an inspector comes around and says, hey, you're lacking roughly 20,000 plants in your pond that needs to be replanted in 90 days. Well, then you can look at those as-builts and say, okay, this is how many were planted. They said we need about this many more, and this is the species that needs to go in there. So super important for that. This is also important for when things like dredging come up, you know, the depth of the pond, so you know how deep you're actually supposed to dig down to. Now, for a wet pond, you're going to have a couple components other than the ones I previously mentioned. So most wet ponds are going to have what's called a forebay. It's that smaller pool area, and that's where a lot of your sediment collects. So as all that runoff comes into the pond, it's going to fill in that forebay there. That area gets dredged out more frequently. It essentially protects the whole pond from having to be dredged. So every so many years, depending on how much development is upstream, you will need to dredge out that forebay there. And as you can see in this image here, the water will rise during a rain event, and it'll increase or lower over the course of 2 to 5 days. This is normal dewatering of a pond. And if the pond stays at a high level, then the riser is probably clogged and should be cleared of debris. And that really helps with routine maintenance. So high water for prolonged periods of time can be costly as it drowns out those beneficial plants that I was just talking about. So wet ponds are required to have a certain amount of littoral plants around the perimeter. These plants pull out nutrients, chemicals from the water, and prevent erosion around the pond bank. They also create a healthy ecosystem for native species. So when you're looking at a couple dollars per plug, and some basins can have upwards of 50,000 plants that go in there, you can see how a planting job can be very expensive for a community just because the riser was clogged and the water was at a higher level for a couple weeks. So if it gets above this littoral zone, then you're looking at reseeding the bank where the grass has died, and now you're increasing your cost even more. Now, if you have the opposite problem and your water level is lower than the orifice, so if you look at that lower image here, you're seeing that PVC pipe come out. Typically, most structures are going to have some kind of cut in the riser or a pipe coming out. That's called your orifice, and that's where your normal water level should be. If it's above that, you probably had a rain event or it's clogged. If it's below that, you probably have a leak unless we're in a time of drought. But if it is below that orifice, then the issue is you probably have a leak somewhere either in your riser, in your dam, or your soils could just be allowing that water to seep down to the ground. And that's fine if it's perking into the ground, but if you do have a leak, things like that will need to be repaired because the inspector will fail you for any kind of leak or damage to the riser or outlet pipe. Now, looking at the wet pond, there are many costs that go into it, and that's why proactive maintenance is always the cheapest and best approach. Proactive maintenance includes planting the proper number of littoral plants and ensuring their survival, removing invasive plant species and harmful algal blooms. So certain invasive plants can actually take over beneficial plants, and if you have a landscaper come in, they'll just go through and treat the whole thing, killing your beneficials, which then you'll have to replant again. So it's important to have proper plant ID here and remove the invasives before they actually get out of control. And then ensuring grass on the slopes is maintained. If you have bare areas or erosion on the slope, then you're allowing more sediment to enter. And this is one more thing that will fail your inspection. And then the most important here, I believe, is just maintaining the correct water level. That can be one of your most costly errors if your water stays too high or too low for too long. Every year, your low cost is just maintenance and mowing. Next is that medium cost. So for erosion and repairs to things like your riser, your inlet and your outlet pipes. And then your highest cost, which is not that frequent, is dredging that forebay. And typically that's around 15 to 20 years. Now, if you have a development or your community is still being developed and sediment is constantly washing into that device, then your time frame moves up a lot. You're probably going to look at dredging more on the couple years to 5-year range. And if the developer's still there, it's really important that you make sure they dredge out that pond before they leave. Because what can happen is that sediment washes in there. They finally finish up construction for the community. They're out of there. They don't dredge it out. And now that dredging cost goes on to you. So for this basin here, the maintenance cost for a whole year is going to be around $1,500 for coming out 20 times throughout the year. Now, they didn't have maintenance, so cattails and willows were able to grow up in this basin. They failed inspection. We had to come in and remove those, and your cost for just removal is around $7,000 when a preventative maintenance costs $1,500. So once again, that proactive management plan is always the cheaper route. Next is a constructed wetland. So same idea, water flows into this device. As it snakes through the wetland, sediment, nutrients, trash, debris are all filtered out, as well as slowing the energy of the water. This type of SCM can be really rewarding to have, or it can also be a nightmare if it's not managed properly. These wetlands are meant to be planted with beneficial wetland plants, which look beautiful when they're in bloom and full. But with all those plants, it can be hard to spot invasive species. One spot of these invasives should be removed, as they can quickly take over a device like this. Maintaining proper water level in these wetlands is also very important, as high water level can drown out these basins. So if you have high water level, again, it clogs that, the riser gets clogged, you drown out all those littoral plants, well, then you're replanting this entire basin. Now, per the Asbuilds, you'll be required to have a certain number of littoral plants in the wetland. That is why routine maintenance is helpful and can spot and react when you have invasive plants entering your wetland and help remove debris, clear off the riser, things like that. Slopes around these should also have maintained grass and prevent erosion, increase sediment into the basin. If you have landscapers maintaining this type of stormwater device, it is important that they do not cut or mow the beneficial plants. I've seen it so many times that landscapers come in and they see things taller than a couple inches and they cut them all down. Well, guess what you're going to be paying more for? More plants. Because once they cut those, if they did kill them and you have an inspection sometime after that, the inspector is going to say, not enough littoral plants in here, you guys need to pay for more. So low cost on this is just routine maintenance and mowing around it. That medium cost is any repairs to those risers, inlet pipes, outlet pipes, and that high cost on this type of basin is replanting. And some of the worst things that can get in there are things like cattails and black willows, because they will take over these types of basins because they're water loving plants, especially in the shallow water. Now, the image on the left is not in compliance due to the lack of littoral plants. Water flushes through, causing increased erosion. It does not filter at all because it's moving through so quickly, as opposed to the image on the right, which is in passing condition. Littoral plants are thriving throughout, filtering the nutrients, trash, sediment. As water flows through the plants, the water energy slows down and allows for a calm release of water from the outlet. Now, moving over to dry ponds, simple as that, they're dry. They're meant to contain the stormwater runoff for up to 72 hours. After 72 hours, the dry pond should be, once again, dry. If the basin is not dry, that means the riser is clogged or the basin is not graded properly, as I mentioned earlier. This means the slope does not allow the water to drain towards that riser. So if you're looking at that image there, here's your riser, that concrete structure in the middle of the basin, and you're having a little bit of water pooling down there. That's because there's a low spot, it wasn't graded properly, and so now water sits there permanently or until it eventually evaporates. Now, if water sits there long enough, it's going to cause bare spots. So if it ever does dry up, then you have these bare soil areas. Now, if inspector comes in there and sees that, you're failing inspection for bare soil. You want to make sure that vegetation on these slopes and throughout a dry pond is maintained, because any bare soil on the slope of one of these basins will cause increased erosion. And so that can look like this, what we call a reel. So if you don't have enough vegetative cover on it, water starts flowing down, pulls sediment with it. And as it continues to do that, it starts cutting into the slope. Once one of these pops up, this is actually a picture from a failed inspection report I just received the other day from a potential client. And they had many of these across all of their basins because there wasn't a lot of vegetation. So catching this early is more cost effective and prevents the basin from failing an inspection and actually having to pay more for bringing in soil to pack it in and reseeding that area. So as I've mentioned, maintaining grass throughout this basin is super important to prevent bare soil. Inlets and inlet channels should also be maintained and be free of any kind of vegetation, and regular inspections to the riser is crucial for preventing flooding. So low cost, once again, is maintenance and mowing. Super easy to do. That next thing is just repairing risers, inlet and outlet pipes that go every few years. And your highest cost is turf amendment. So if that riser is clogged and water pools and this turns into a wet pond, well, everything under that water level is now bare soil. It needs to be essentially revegetated, seeded, strawed, things like that. And that can get costly depending on how large of a dry pond you have. So bioretentions or rain gardens can look different depending on the engineer. Some are planted and mulched like the top image, while others look similar to a dry pond with caps popping up. As water flows into the bio, the water percolates down through the media, eventually leading through to the underground pipes. Depending on the type of design installed will dictate which management plan should be best used. If there's an adjacent construction that has stormwater runoff into the bio, then additional measures should be taken. So in the Carolinas, or for much of the Carolinas, we have a lot of clay. So in a bio or a rain garden, clay is this basin's worst nightmare. It goes into this basin, and underneath that mulch, or in the lower image there, you have just sod on top. Below all of that is sand and a media below that. Clay is finer than sand, so it passes through all of that and clogs up that media, preventing water from actually perking down into those under drains and leaving that basin. So after a period of time, as water flows in here, it starts flooding this basin out because there's so much clay in there. And then you end up having a wet pond. You're going to fail inspection. This can be very costly because to fix something like this, you're actually digging up that entire basin. So you're removing all those plants, or even sometimes in this case, trees that they'll plant out there. You're digging that up. You're removing that upper layer of media, getting rid of that clay and refreshing it. On the coast where you have sandier soil, you typically don't have a huge problem with this, but in places that you do find a lot more Carolina clay, just be careful that if these are already installed and construction goes nearby or upstream from this and you see it start entering, you want to either divert that water or add an additional buffer there. So if your bio resembles that image, then refreshing the mulch is going to be necessary every few years. Now, when you do that, you actually have to remove the old mulch. Otherwise, it turns into compost, once again impacting the basin and its ability to drain water. If the plants in the bio should die for any reason, they also need to be replaced, because just like in a wetland, this is supposed to have so many plants in it, and they serve a purpose. If you allow weeds, other grasses, things like that to start getting into this basin, then you're also going to fail inspection, and it's going to be a lot harder to maintain because you're going through and trying to selectively remove the invasive or weedy plants as opposed to the beneficials. Low cost is just maintenance. Next, medium cost every few years is refreshing that mulch, as I mentioned, or any small repairs done to the riser. And that high cost is if clay or sediment gets into this basin and it needs to be completely rebuilt. So sand filters are similar to bios, but instead of plants and mulch, it's like a big sandbox. So it's important to not let vegetation grow in that sand media, as well as preventing large amounts of sediment from entering that basin. So once again, that clay, you don't want it anywhere near any kind of device like this, because it will clog up those sand filters and you will have to refresh that entire media. Typically, when you're looking at something like that, sand filters, to rebuild them, at least $40,000–$50,000. So you really want to avoid having any kind of big cost like that. Something that's not typically seen in communities is underground stormwater devices. They're more common in high-priced real estate areas like uptown Charlotte or really dense urban areas. You can see these. The big issue with them is they're underground. People forget about them. And when you forget about them, they fill up with sediment debris over time. And then that high cost is actually just removing, getting a back truck in there and pumping all of that stuff out, which can be time consuming and a high cost just to mobilize that kind of equipment. But most communities will not have this inside their stormwater device plan. Now, something that's usually seen more around Raleigh and that surrounding area are level spreaders. And they're essentially found on the backside of other stormwater devices. So your outlet usually flows into these. The idea is it spreads the water out, it dissipates a little bit more of that water energy, and it acts as an additional buffer or filter. I haven't really seen these in South Carolina at all, and not really outside of the Raleigh-Durham area. Now, proactive is just regular maintenance on this that's usually already included with the basin that's flowing into it. That medium cost is refreshing the riprap area, so that rocky area, and the high cost on this is rebuilding it, because if that level spreader isn't level, well, then it's not actually doing its job. Now, a good maintenance plan, specialized mowing, and a team who can perform stormwater repairs will save you from failing inspections and paying for fees that come with large repairs. So even as simple as if you look at that picture of the water lily there, those small green dots right there, it's duckweed. So if someone didn't know better and they were just passing by and thought that looked pretty, well, duckweed is an aquatic plant that doubles in size every single day. So you have that one little plant there, the next day you have 2, then 4, then 8, and by the end of the month you have millions. And that can quickly take over a pond. So it's something as simple as that, people noticing what's out there, having the proper plant ID, and actually knowing how to perform treatments is gonna save a community that has these stormwater devices. Now at Aqua, we pride ourselves on a comprehensive maintenance plan. So having detailed and timely reports, proactive vegetation management, and the ability to perform minor repairs on site and advocating for the client during the inspection process. And that's what we recommend to you guys, is having someone who's going to have these detailed reports, who's going to constantly monitor these basins and look for things that the homeowner wouldn't normally look for, or the property manager wouldn't know to look for, because they don't have that background. An example of our report shows a lot more pictures of the site, the issues on the site, so you never have to wonder what we're talking about when we refer to there's a reel or erosion on your slope. And that way you also don't even have to visit the site, because we're actually showing you those issues. And most reports are going to come out in real time, so that way you're actually seeing them, and those are communicated to you immediately if those issues are more serious. That way you're not running into surprises like this. So in this case, this could have been prevented with routine maintenance and inspections. The cost of a job like this can be out of budget for a lot of communities, but it's required to be repaired. So once this happens, an inspector sees this, or if it just blows out, you have no choice but to have this repaired. And this all starts with a little bit of a sinkhole from water flowing down that outlet barrel there. So I actually have a site right now that I looked at. There's a sinkhole forming next to the riser. We were able to catch it early and fix that before it ever got to this scale. And this can be 5, even 6-figure job, depending on how big of a basin you have in your community. Now, back to the fountains. If you're trying to increase curb appeal for your wet pond, you can add a fountain. So it adds a little bit of value to the community just from the aesthetic standpoint, and it does add a certain amount of oxygen back to a body of water. Now, for a larger pond, like I said, you need to make sure you have the correct fountain in there. I usually only tell people to add these if they're looking for an aesthetic value out of the fountain. If you're looking for more health benefits out of it, you're going to look at a bottom diffused aeration. And what that is a diffuser head, so a plate with micro holes in it, creates small bubbles, flows up through the water column, and creates a plume of bubbles. This is pumping oxygen back into the water body, so it increases the health of the pond. It's reducing the chance of those harmful algal blooms. So you're putting a lot of oxygen back in. Those harmful algal blooms don't really like a lot of oxygen. So you're going to see less frequent blooms or less severe blooms. It also decreases the amount of muck buildup in ponds. So if your stormwater device or your pond is situated around a lot of trees, or it has a lot of leaf litter, things like that, grass clippings blowing into it, over time, that bottom layer builds up. So it accumulates sticks, debris, leaves, things like that. And so over the course of years or decades, you can actually lose your pond just to that muck layer, where all of a sudden you only have a foot of water in there and you're having constant algae blooms. Pumping oxygen into that body of water will actually burn off a lot of that organic debris. Now, it will not do anything for things like sand, silt, or clay. It'll only burn off that organic debris. And then putting more oxygen back in your pond also allows for larger fish populations. So if your community is really keen on fishing around those bodies of water, then this is something you can also add to increase the value. And then also fish stocking. So if people really like to recreate around these stormwater devices, then you can stock them with fish. They also serve as a biological control. So we can stock grass carp in there so they can actually eat up the macrophyte algae that's growing in there, taking over a pond. And they act as little lawnmowers that'll swim around. But you only stock certain fish in for certain things. So it's important to know what you have, to know what you need to stock, and then you're just increasing that biodiversity. So thank you for allowing me to speak with you guys today. And if you guys have any other questions.
We got lots of them.
Perfect.
Lots of them. So how often should spillways be checked or cleared? Are they treated the same as a pond?
Absolutely. So spillway is another component in your pond, your dry pond, really any kind of stormwater device. Typically they're covered in rock, but you can see them be concreted over. You can have an earthen spillway. No matter what type of spillway you have, it's very important to maintain them. So if there's debris in them or vegetation growing, a lot of times I see briars and tall grasses grow up on these spillways. Well, they end up, once those spillways are necessary and you have all that vegetation on there, it actually prevents that water from flowing. And then you end up having essentially a blockage on your spillway. So that water level increases. Typically with a maintenance plan, depending on what type of device, for wet ponds, bios, certain sand filters and wetlands, I typically try to say at least once a month inspection. What I recommend is usually 2 times a month, so every 2 weeks in the growing season here in the Carolinas. So that's pretty much March through October you're looking at, and then once a month in the winter time, so November, December, January, and February, just because there's not as much going on. But they do need to be inspected, as if they start being used more frequently because your riser is clogged, typically you're going to have erosion in your spillway more than anywhere else. And so the spillway should only be used about 10% of the time, as your riser is used about 90% of the time. So that spillway is when you have really heavy rain events or those like 100-year storms, things like that.
So we have a number of turnover related questions, and I'm going to paraphrase kind of maybe several into one. But the big issue is, how do we engage the developer in the turnover of ponds and get them to do what we want them to do, more or less?
It's really having a conversation with that developer and bringing in a third party and saying, we're bringing in a stormwater expert. We'd like, and I've sat on many of these meetings where I show up with the board members and with the developer. We look at those basins and say, this is what needs to be done before it gets turned over. And usually once the developer realizes you have a professional on site, he or she is going to be more receptive to doing those repairs. Now, if the board or the property manager knows what needs to be done out there and they they bring that developer out and say, hey, this is what we need done before it gets handed over. Most developers will go ahead and fix those issues, repair anything that needs to be repaired before it hands over. But if no one brings that to their attention, they're not going to do it. So the biggest thing is just having a conversation with them, meeting them on site, walking these stormwater devices with them, and pointing out the issues that you have with those devices.
Okay. I've been on the board for a number of years and I've never seen a municipal inspection performed. How do we know that they are happening?
So good question. Depending on which county you live in, some of them are understaffed. Some of them don't get around to every single basin. I went to a basin that has full-grown trees in them, and it was one of the first stormwater devices in the Charlotte area, and they finally got inspected after 30 something years. And they had to essentially have a deforestation project to clear out this dry pond that was now a forest. Not every basin gets inspected. Some of them slip through the cracks, but the problem with that is people get used to their basin slipping through the cracks. And when the inspector finally comes out there, if you're not in compliance, well, then they're going to ding you for that. And you're either failing inspection or you're having those fines. So the biggest thing is just being proactive, making sure your basin is in compliance at all times. A lot of the times you will actually, if it is getting inspected annually, then you're going to receive, whether it's the property manager or the HOA board, you're going to receive a letter that's stating that you're passing or failing. So always be on the lookout for that. And some inspectors will actually give you a heads up. If they're nice, they'll let you know they're coming out to inspect, so you have time to make sure your basin is in compliance.
So we hear them called BMPs. What does that stand for?
So you probably live in South Carolina if you hear BMP. South Carolina is a little behind the curve on this. So all stormwater devices used to be called BMPs. That stands for Best Management Practice. In the last couple years, they switched the term from BMP to SCM, so Stormwater Control Measure. So the DEQ for South Carolina still calls them BMPs. North Carolina calls them SCMs. So they're the exact same thing, just two different names.
Okay, you mentioned grass over 12 inches in height is a finable offense. Can you explain the negative impact of tall grass on the slope? NCF and W, Fish and Wildlife, has stated that allowing tall grass on the perimeter of the pond will discourage geese, which is desired.
So nothing discourages geese. They will, if they want to come in that pond, they will come in that pond. In Raleigh specifically, and in that surrounding area, if any vegetation is above 12 inches on the slope or the dam, they will fine you. In other areas, that's not necessarily the case. So depending on who your inspector is, South Carolina, typically, I haven't seen them fine anyone for taller than 12 inches. But the issue with that is if you start getting vegetation that's taller than 12 inches, typically that means it's not being mowed on a regular basis. Once it's not being mowed on a regular basis, if it's done by a landscape crew, what happens is they see that, they typically avoid mowing it. Then you have briars, woody vegetation, things like that that start taking root in that thick grass. Once that starts happening, really no one starts mowing it. And then you start getting trees. The issue is specifically with a wet pond, and it can be on a dry pond as well, but in a wet pond more so, if you have woody vegetation, mainly trees growing on your dam, the issue is if they die, if they fall, if someone cuts them down, all of a sudden your dam is at risk of blowing out because those roots, once they start rotting, the water passes through and it's a perfect channel for that water to pull more sediment through. Trees like to send their roots towards water, so they're going to send it to the pond and on the backside of the dam, and it's essentially connecting those two paths. If the tree were to fall or blow over in a storm event, you actually rip out your entire dam and then it blows out. So that's really where it comes from, is just having constant mowing on your dam because of how we've seen the progression move towards, once they stop mowing, typically it ends up having large trees on the dam. Now, the rule of thumb, if you're looking at trying to be in compliance. For a dam, if a tree is less than 4 inches in diameter at your chest height, then you should remove that tree. If it's larger than that, you're actually going to do more harm than good at removing that tree at this point in time. So it's best to just leave the tree there. But dams specifically really need to be mowed and kept clear at all times. The rest of the slope around the pond, inspectors are typically a little more lenient on unless you are in the Raleigh-Durham area.
Well, I've had a $700,000 dam repair in one of our communities a few years ago. So take care of your dams. So I'm going to consolidate two questions, and you may not be able to answer this, but what happens if a developer never turns over the ponds, and can they simply turn them over by deeding it to the association?
So I have seen developers essentially bypass board members and just hand it over directly without the board accepting it. That doesn't happen all that often, but I have seen it. You can have a little more fight to go back to the developer if there are issues that need to be repaired. In that case, if no board member or property manager signed ownership of it and they just handed it over. As far as the first question, can you repeat that first one again?
I think the first question was the developer hasn't turned them over. Do they have to?
They do have to. I've seen developers go bankrupt before they turn them over, and it defaults to the community. But as far as just not turning them over, that typically doesn't happen. If that is a case for someone out there, definitely look into that. Reach out to the developer, have them hand it over to you if all the basins look like they are in good condition. But typically, it does have to get handed over to whoever is going to own that community at that point.
Okay, we have requested the as-built drawings, but have received nothing. Do we go to the local municipality or the state to try and find them?
Go start with your local municipality first. They're typically the ones that are going to have your as-builds. And then if you're not getting any response, if you're showing up and you're still not getting anything out of them, then move up from there.
Okay, I think you had flashed a chart maybe before. It said, what is the name of the chart with the pond spec?
So it's as built. So ASBUILT.
Okay.
But always ask for those for any community. They are very valuable, not just for stormwater.
Okay. How often should you do a study to check the depth of your ponds, and at what depth should they be dredged?
It depends. So if you have development upstream from your pond, or your community is continuing to develop and it flows into that pond, then you should do, really, if it's continuing, you're going to look at quarterly inspections of sediment depth. So if it's constantly flowing in, you're seeing high turbidity, so you're seeing a lot of sediment suspended in that water. That means you're having constant sediment washing in. So you're going to want to measure that, because it is super important to have that documentation, written and photographic documentation, that sediment is entering the basin, especially if it's the developer still being on site, or if it's another property that's impacting your stormwater device, then you can hold them liable, but that is only if you have that documentation. So if you have sediment depth tests, so on September 20th, I took a depth test and there's 3 inches of sediment in the basin. And then 3 months later, I take another sediment depth test and now there's 2 feet of sediment in that basin. Then that developer or that community that's impacting your stormwater device should be held liable for fronting the cost of dredging that forebay or that pond. Now, if the basin doesn't have any development around it, there's no new sediment really washing in large quantities, then you're checking that depth, once a year, once every couple of years, and you're not really worried about dredging, you're looking at it more on the decades scale as opposed to every few years. But that is for a very established community and an established BMP.
Okay, I'll make a note, just say it is 5:30. So we're going to go approximately another 15 minutes answering questions. So if you do need to leave, thank you for joining. And but for those of you staying on, we'll continue on with some questions. So we've got a number of them that have rolled in. So we'll try and get through them as much as we can for 15 minutes. So would Aquadoc or any of the other service providers get involved with the city when obtaining extensions on getting repairs completed so the HOA does not get fined? And how does that process work?
Absolutely. So if you bring us in and you have, say you need to have dredging or your riser is leaking and you failed inspection. And let's say we have a time frame, we show that to the city, the county, they are very understanding of that. As long as they see that you are trying to fix the issues that you failed inspection on, they're not concerned with coming back with fines and being on top of you, as long as there is a time frame and a game plan. Now, if you keep putting them off, then that's when they're going to come back and start fining you. So as long as you work with a company and that company will go through and say, hey, this is our plan, this is our quote, we've already bid it out to them, they're accepting it, the city and county will leave you alone. They will want to see the inspection after that repair has been done, though.
Okay, you may have answered this earlier, but at what frequency do you recommend contractors to inspect your ponds?
As far as inspecting, like on a maintenance plan, if you're looking at maintenance, what I recommend for wet ponds is a 20 visit service. So like I said, every 2 weeks in the growing season, and in those 4 months in the winter time in the Carolinas, we're dropping down to once a month because we can maintain it for that one treatment for the one time in the month. But here in the Carolinas, we get so many nutrients, such high temperatures, long daylight hours, that with a wet pond, you're constantly going to grow algae. You're going to grow, you're getting invasive species in constantly, whether it's from animals bringing it in or washing in from another basin. Things like the duckweed, the water meal, these are all floating plants that stick on geese and ducks that they'll transfer to other ponds, and they double every single day. So they'll take over your entire pond in less than a month if they're not treated. And that's why we would come out every 2 weeks. With things like sand filters, dry ponds, you can drop that down to a once a month inspection just to, remove the trash, treat the invasive plants in those riprap spillway areas, document if there's any leaks, things like that. But as far as an overall inspection for the entire basin, that usually gets done once a year and it's submitted to the county, and then that gets you through for the next year.
Can you give an approximate cost range for dredging?
Very much depends on how much is being pulled out. So if you're looking at a small pond, less than an acre, and you're only dredging that 4-bay section, you're looking at probably no less than 10,000 up to probably 40, 50,000 on the high end for a small pond. Now I have a lake right now that we're working with, and we're dredging out over an acre from their head section of their 4-bay, and it's a 17-acre lake. That cost just to remove all of it is around $350,000. So this is where you really want that maintenance, that proactive maintenance, to say, hey, this is how much sediment is washing in. This is when we should start dredging, because when it gets to that level of severity, your cost jumps up so much when you're removing that amount of sediment. But it is all dependent on how much is washing in. In that case, they also have a creek that flows that's tied into their lake. Creeks, if they're ever tied into a basin, you're constantly going to have sediment. So your dredging time frame just went from 15 to 20 years down to 5-10 years.
Okay, this is a long question. I'm going to try and consolidate it, but we're working within our 1 year period with the developer. We've noted issues. We don't feel like we're getting the results we need. Is there anyone that we would escalate that to within the city? And this is a Raleigh-based association.
Absolutely. So you can reach out to the local municipality and just let them know what's going on. Typically, they will work with you guys, try to push that developer into fixing those things. Another recommendation is bringing a third party professional into the mix. I can't tell you how many times I've been brought into a situation where the developer wasn't really cooperating with the HOA, the board, or the property manager. I came in and said, this is what needs to be done before it gets handed over because this is in violation. And all of a sudden, these things are being repaired. So it does pay off to bring in a third party inspector or even an engineer that's certified for stormwater devices.
Okay, is a lake or body of water that is fed from an underground aquifer or no inlet structure that existed before the community was built, but now collects community runoff from storm drains considered an SCM?
Yes. Anything, no matter what it was beforehand, if it allows stormwater runoff to enter that basin, is now a stormwater device. So a lot of communities have turned old farm ponds or old spring ponds into stormwater devices because it's convenient. It was already there. They built the community around it and they just dump all their stormwater into it. If there is an inlet pipe that's coming off of your community, it is a stormwater device. Once again, you can refer back to those Asbuilds, but if you're looking for those common identifiers, inlet pipes, the riser, things like that, typically stormwater device. And Aqueduct, we offer free consults, so we will come out to every single one of your sites 100% free to look at them and just talk to you about the site itself and say, hey, yeah, this is a stormwater device. This is what you need repaired. These are, things that would pass or fail an inspection, and this is what we would recommend for a maintenance plan.
Okay, what types of repairs are usually required for risers?
Typically repairing leaks in the seams. So if it's a concrete riser, there are seams where they put one concrete block on top of the other to build up that riser structure. Around those seams, they'll blow out after a number of years, or they'll leak if they weren't properly sealed. That's a pretty common one. If the orifice is broken or damaged, the trash rack, which is the metal debris screen on top of that riser, whether it's a metal riser, a concrete riser, whatever, that can either rust over time or be damaged from people, wildlife, whatever. I've seen a beaver actually clog up a trash rack in a body of water so well that it didn't allow any water to flow through it. The water in that lake rose 4 feet over the next couple months to where when I went out there to clear it off, I didn't even realize they had a riser out there. And we actually had to siphon down the entire lake to clean off that riser. A couple months later, it happened again, and the entire trash rack dropped to the bottom of the riser because there's so much head pressure. So you can see a lot of those happen. It's important if you get those critters out there to remove them because they will cause a lot of damage to those devices.
Okay, I've been told various things on the use of pond fountains. Fountains have been described as primarily cosmetic, but other descriptions cite fountains are important to filter water. Are fountains required, or are they strictly a cosmetic addition if already installed? Are there different kinds of fountains that would be useful as filtering systems?
They are not required. They are on the North Carolina Stormwater page as added benefit to a stormwater device because they do mix the water column. They do add a little bit of oxygen if it's the right size fountain. But the issue with that is if it is spraying too close to the bank or actually put in a shallow body of water, it's actually resuspending that sediment and debris in the water column and you're actually allowing sediment to re-enter our creeks and streams. So it very much depends on in which instance it's put in. If it's put in properly and used properly, it is an added benefit, aesthetic, and adds a little bit of oxygen, but not as much as those bottom diffusers. But overall, if you want to put a fountain in or already have a fountain in there, there's no point in removing it as long as it's not doing any harm to the shoreline or pulling up more sediment.
Okay, our pond was put in by the developer about 20 years ago. It has fish in it. The last time it was stocked was about 15 years ago, and it still has fish. Should we do anything in terms of fish management, and should we consider periodically restocking?
Is 100% up to you. So if the community really is about their fish, then you can do things like an electro fishing study where you sample the fish that are out there and we can tell you this is the population, it's a healthy population, it's not a healthy population, this is what we recommend stocking, things like that. But there's no requirement for that. So it's really based off the need of the community. I have some communities that are 100% about fishing and they stock their pond frequently. They put in fish habitat. There's fish feeders around because the community just really enjoys being a part of that pond and the ecosystem that it provides there. But yeah, if you have community members that are really interested in fishing, it is an added benefit that if you do have a wet pond there, you can stock it, and it does bring a lot of enjoyment for those homeowners.
And I'm probably wrong, but I've been told that there are 3 types of fish: carp, bluegill, and bass are the ones that go into a pond. Am I wrong?
So
Maybe a little.
yeah, there's a lot of different fish that can go into a pond. Those are the main 3 that do, but it really depends on what kind of fish habitat you're looking for. So if you're looking for, a bass heavy pond, then we're going to stock certain types of fish. If you're looking for, more of a catfish pond, then we're going to put in more bait fish, some catfish, things like that. Some people like crappie to go in there, but others hate them because they take over and outcompete all the other fish. But it very much depends on what you're looking for as far as the fish habitat in your pond.
Yeah, and imagine the cost is, well, I know the cost varies from types of fish you select, right? So
yeah, and typically when we stock fish, they're going to be juvenile fish. They're going to range around a couple inches, and that way they have time to grow and reproduce over the next couple of years. And then they're at that trophy size that a lot of people like. The only ones that we stock real large from the get-go is grass carp because we want them to go ahead and start eating those macrophyte algae, things that'll take over your pond. But if a client specifically requested trophy bass to be put in, then we can definitely do something like that. But we usually recommend putting them at the juvenile state because they are more cost effective that way.
Yeah. So our community does not have a pond, but it has a stormwater issue that's resulting from 3 communities coming together. We tried working with our landscapers and drainage companies, but they have only been so helpful. We've contacted the city, but haven't heard anything back. Is this something that you can assist with?
Absolutely. We've worked with many communities rerouting stormwater if it's negatively impacting the community. It's just a matter of us getting out there and taking a look at the site, seeing what's going on, and then figuring out a plan on how to best route that water.
Okay. Who enforces the developer to do repairs?
Municipalities.
Yeah.
So a lot of the times developers will have one last inspection before they hand it over to the community. If you're lucky, the inspector will catch those repairs and then that developer will quickly repair them, hand it over to you. Sometimes, and I've seen it firsthand, those developers don't get dinged on the things that they need to repair because they either know somebody or they're bringing a lot of revenue to that area, so they don't have to repair them. And then what happens is it gets passed on to the HOA, the board, and that community. And that's where you do want a third party in there beforehand to facilitate that handover and that transition. So that way that community is not getting handed a 5-6 figure repair job.
So, and there are a lot of questions regarding turnover, and Alex, I don't want to put you in a position answering certain questions. There are probably a few questions with turnover that should be addressed more to an attorney, but they're default questions, and if they don't turn them over, types of questions. So I think a few of these questions I'm going to say probably recommend an attorney to get involved, unless you have experience forcing developers to do certain things.
Yeah, it is always beneficial. I mean, like I said, having a third party come in, bringing an inspector in and the county all at the same time and having that conversation, and you can figure out why it's not being turned over. Sometimes it can be not turned over because they still have to fix some issues and they're trying to put that off. Other times it's just they need that extra push, and having all those parties in one place on site is that extra push. But if you end up running into issues with the developer still not handing over, then it is probably a good idea to go ahead and have legal counsel brought in.
Do you have a recommended depth for wet ponds that you like to see?
Um, I usually like to see at least 6 feet, but it very much depends. If it's a small pond, you're restricted by how quickly the slope tapers off, because around here you can't just have a steep drop off for safety issues, because if someone were to walk in and then all of a sudden be above their head in water, they're not able to get out. So legally there's actually supposed to be a littoral shelf around it, so if someone were to start walking into a pond, they're in a couple inches, couple feet before it really drops off, and then they can kind of walk themselves back out. For larger basins, the deeper the better, because sunlight's not reaching those deeper spots and growing algae as quickly. The shallower the basin, the more growth you're going to have. You're going to have cattails, you're going to have algae, you're going to have all types of invasive aquatic species growing in there because of how shallow it is and how warm that water body is.
Okay, one question is about doing business in South Carolina. So remind everybody of the different locations you're servicing.
So Aqueduct actually services all of North and South Carolina. So we have offices in Wilmington that covers the entire coast down to Charleston and a little bit further. We have a Raleigh office that covers the Raleigh-Durham Triangle area. And then my specific area that I go out to is from Greensboro all the way over to the mountains and then down really as far as North Augusta.
Okay. Okay, two last questions. One, are grass cutting service mows the grass surrounding the pond into the pond water? Are they liable for the cost of dredging or for the maintenance of the pond fountain by getting clippings into the pond?
That's really, really difficult, because for them to pretty much make it where you need dredging just from grass clippings, that has to be years and years of them throwing the clippings into the pond. I would just say, hey, if you guys can't turn your mower in the other direction and throw your clippings on the slope as opposed to into the pond, we'll find another landscape company, because there's 1,000,001 landscape companies out there. So it's really easy to just get them to actually mow properly by just saying, hey, if you're not going to do it, we're going to get someone who will do it right. But I would recommend, if you have landscape crews that mow up to the pond edge, that they blow their clippings away from the pond as opposed to in, because as you're stating, those clippings will 100% clog that fountain all the time. So you really want to prevent them from going in. Not only will they clog the fountain, grass clippings will actually add added nutrients into the water body, which will increase the amount of algal blooms that you have. But yes,
Okay.
they will increase the muck layer over time, and that's where you do want to probably have something that's being put into the water to help burn that off, or adding that aeration.
Okay, last question. Have you ever worked with NCDOT regarding pond and environmental issues? In 1999, the NCDOT issued a letter to its divisions to consider environmental concerns which may be more important than the NCDOT road standards.
Yes, so I had to do some work around wetlands, and it's very difficult to do any work around wetlands. You have to have a lot of permits to do that because they are protected. And so anytime you you bring in a wetland, you have to start bringing in. This one was near roadway, so it was NCDOT. It was the state of North Carolina. They had to come out, actually inspect and see the environmental impact that any work was done and how it would impact that wetland there. But yeah, we will partner in certain instances with NCDOT, certain municipalities, Army Corps of Engineers, whoever we need to partner with or do the work with, we will partner with them and make sure everything is running smoothly and legally.
Okay, well, that was the last question. As a reminder, and I should say there are a few questions about where they can get a copy of the recording. So if you want to, you can visit camsmgt.com. Under the board member resources section, it's going to be listed under webinars. And so we do have about 30-ish webinars over the 3 years we've been hosting these webinars. So feel free to view this one, probably not until Monday next week, but this will be available as well as all of the others that we have held. So thank you for your attendance tonight, Alex. Thank you for leading us through this interesting topic. So always learn something. So, and we look forward to our next one. So thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Good night.